Boundaries in relationships. That's what I want to talk about this morning. We live on a very crowded planet. There are over 7 billion people on this planet. There would be no need for boundaries in relationships if we were all living alone in our igloo on Baffin Island. There'd be no need for this seminar, but we live together and we rub shoulders together day by day in company with others, and we are social creatures, and that's the way we would have it. So we need to have boundaries one with the other. Reminds me of a story of a Scottish young man who went to Harvard University for the first time, and he was in the dorm there. His mother called and said, "Donald, how are things going?" He says, "Mother, things are going very well, but these people are very strange, especially at night." He says, "There's one man who's screaming all the time in the dorm room next door. And then there's another man who's constantly batting his head against the wall." Mother said, "Donald, how can you take such a thing?" And he said, "Mother, I don't mind it very much. I just keep playing my bagpipes." Now that's a boundary issue. We're going to talk about boundaries this morning. I am not trying to rehash a book that was written, a seminal, 20 years ago by Cloud and Townsend called Boundaries. You'll see it out in the bookstall at the back. It's a very good book. I'm not trying to just present what was in the book, but I'd like to give you perhaps a different way of looking at those things, not contradictory, but complementary to what is written in the book. I do recommend what was written there. In order to really get a proper perspective, and a Christian perspective on this subject, we need to look at God. We need to start with God first, because God is a God of relationship. Relational love exists in the Trinity. And some people might say, "Jim, why are you talking about the Trinity? The word is not mentioned in the Scriptures." And that is true. But the Trinity is everywhere in the Scriptures. And by the way, the word boundary is mentioned very rarely in the Scriptures, and not at all in regard to relationships with people. It's talking about boundary lines of nationalities and tribes and so on. Do not move the ancient boundaries, it says in the Old Testament. But even though these words are not mentioned, they're in the warp and woof of Scripture. On every page, you see the Trinity, and on every page, you see issues of boundary, because God is a relational God, and He has relational love. Long before He created you and me and chose to pour His love upon mankind, there was love in the Trinity. There were those in the Trinity, the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit, who were loving one another. Not only that, but God made us for relationship with Him first and with one another as well. He made us for relationship. He made us for love. He made us to share life together. And one thing that's for sure is that we're heading for a great relational eternity. Because heaven is going to be a place where people walk and talk with one another. That's what the streets are for. They're for walking and talking with one another, and for enjoyment on every street corner. There will be a Tim Hortons. No, I don't know if Heaven's Best will be better than Tim Hortons, okay? And we'll be able to sit there and we'll be able to enjoy on a wonderful sunny heaven afternoon conversation with one another. There'll be lots of things to do, lots of things to share in glory. It will be a place of loving relationships forever. So if people are antisocial, they have the farthest to go in regard to change, because when you come into a relationship with God, He makes you not only spiritual, but He makes you social, because He is a social God. So this is what we're learning. We're learning how to be social. We're learning how to relate to one another the way God would have us relate. God is not only a God of relationship, He's a God of boundaries. God has personal boundaries. And even within the Trinity, although there is one God, there are three people. And the Father is not the Son, is not the Spirit. They have boundaries, one with another. And when it comes to His relationship to us, God has boundaries. Now, there's a lot of New Age thinking that permeates our culture today, and I've heard people say even this week, God is everywhere, and therefore God is in me, and therefore I'm in God, and God is me. Well, although God is everywhere, he's not everyone. God is a person, and he has his personal boundaries. And I'm not God, nor is the person who sits in my office and thinks perhaps that they're God. I assure them that they're not. Although God is everywhere, he is not everyone. So he has personal boundaries and he has moral boundaries. God is omnipotent. But there are limits to his omnipotence. You say, Jim, how can God have limits to his omnipotence? Because he will never do anything that's contrary to his moral character. So there are things God can't do. It says in Titus chapter 1, verse 2, God can't lie. He can't. It's not in his character. He never crosses that line and lies. God can't sin. He's holy. And so God definitely has moral lines and moral boundaries. Anything that is inconsistent with his character, you'll never catch God doing. Now about us, we're human beings. And just as God has two kinds of boundaries, so do we. I like to make things simple. I spend my thinking hours trying to simplify things, not to make them so simple that they're trite, but to make them simple so that people can understand them. And if there's only one thing you walk away with today, it's this. There's two kinds of boundaries. There's moral boundaries and there are personal boundaries. A moral boundary is the line that divides between right and wrong. The line that divides between right and wrong. When something ceases to be right and becomes wrong, ceases to be good and becomes evil, there's a line there. Sometimes that line is kind of obscure for you and me, and we have to learn to draw the lines better. I hope we do. But for God, it's a very straight and clear and strong line. Then there's personal boundaries. It's also a line. It marks out what is mine, and it marks out what is mine to possess. It really is the content of my life, my values, my qualities, my goals, my desires. It's content of my life. Now, there's a difference between these two boundaries, and I would like to illustrate them in this way. When you think of moral boundaries, think of stone fence. We were in England a couple years ago, and there's lots of stone fences in England, and they've been there for hundreds of years, dividing one person's property from another, so that the animals don't stray from one field to another. These ancient stone fences serve as endless markers of the landscape. And when you fly over England and you fly over Ireland, you see these lovely stone fences. They are fixed and they are immovable. When you think of moral boundaries, think of a stone fence. Fixed, immovable, because that is how God operates with moral boundaries. He's got fixed, immovable lines, and he doesn't deviate. Personal boundaries, well, I've got an elastic band in my hand. I put it on my hand just so I wouldn't forget it. You ever do that? Then the blood starts draining from your hand. And there's the elastic band. It's got a kind of shape, but you see, because it's elastic, the shape can bend and flex, and it's pliable, it's malleable, it's able to bend into different shapes. And it's strong, and it has some kind of shape, but it's pliable. Now, I would suggest to you that's more like what moral boundaries ought to be. Because there is a kind of character of life that enables us to be able to bend and flow with the exigencies of circumstance. We want to be able to be pliable. We want to be able to meet the situation in the way it requires and not be inflexible. See, the problem comes is when we make personal boundaries like thick stone fences, and we make our moral boundaries like elastic bands. That's when real problems come with boundaries. So we're going to try and separate out the two. Then we will have much more wisdom as to boundaries. When it comes to personal boundaries, we can look at it this way as well. Draw a circle. And this circle is you. It's like the space inside the elastic band. And inside that circle, there's all sorts of qualities. There's all sorts of personal strengths. There's feelings. There's body life. There's desires. There's time. There's my will and determination, responsibilities, possessions, thoughts, other resources, financial, physical, or otherwise. All of these things are part of my personal life and inside my personal boundary. And there's personal space as well. Personal space is one of those interesting things. I could do a little poll as to how long is your personal space. I mean, how much width? When you stand with someone, what is the acceptable distance at which that person stands when you have the most peace? And when they get within that personal space, I think it's about 18 inches myself, somewhere around 18 inches. For some people, it's a few miles. And then other people are really get close and right in your face. 18 inches is probably a good Canadian length. All right, I'm feeling really good. They're at 18 inches. And then I get on the subway train. Then what happens? Everybody starts crowding together. You know, it's bad enough in the subways in Toronto, but in the subways in Japan, they have so many people in Tokyo. It's so crowded. They actually have subway pushers. Japanese subway pushers. They have these men standing there. See, they have official uniforms. And what they do is when the train is about to leave, they actually compress the crowd at the door to get every last person in time. Now, can you imagine if you had a problem with personal space? Give me my space. I need 18 inches. So you see, there has to be some flexibility there, or else you'll never be able to get on a subway train. We're going to look at 5 issues or 5 influences that determine how we have personally formed our personal boundaries and our moral boundaries. We're talking about boundary formation. And for most of the rest of this particular session, we're going to talk about the formation of boundaries. 5 influences. And the first one would probably not be mentioned at all if we were in a secular gathering, because people don't believe this. It's called the S factor, which means the sin factor. The Bible states that the first cause of boundary violation is a defective sin nature. David says, I was born in sin, and I was shaped. You know, talk about the shape. I was shaped in iniquity. We don't have to teach a child to do wrong. Quite by instinct, they learn how to lie. Quite by instinct, they learn how to cheat. Quite by instinct, they become covetous. Quite by instinct, they learn how to lash out. We tend to sin innately. It's like we were born with the habit. I saw a cartoon recently, and it says this. The psychologist sitting there and saying, Tommy's little outbursts are really just a cry for better parents. It's all about bad parenting. Now, we're going to talk about parenting in a minute. But you could be the most perfect parents, and you might have a little devil for a child. Why? Because of the S factor. There were some great kings that are listed amongst the kings in Israel. Their children were terrors. And then there were some awful kings, and their children were angels. So it doesn't compute, you see, that it's always because of bad parenting that we get disobedient and destructive and bad children. The S factor. We have to remember that as we go along. We're not going to spend a lot of time on it. We're going to just remember that is the first thing that influences our boundary formation, and that is we're bent out of shape from the start. Number 2, the influence of personality. I like this subject. I like looking into it. People like looking into it because it's fun to see the differences of personality. 3 years ago, my son and daughter-in-law had twins. When they first came out, they looked very similar. One was a boy, one was a girl. But it didn't take us long to realize that their personalities were quite different. Little boy, more quiet, more contemplative, more able to play alone, more sensitive. The little girl, the opposite. Strong-willed, expressive, outward, very determined. When she puts on a pout, the sky darkens. So we have different personalities, and it's the card you're dealt with by the hand of God from the time of conception. And so different personalities are liable to different boundary violations because they have different goals and means of achieving those goals. And they have different values, things that they aim for in life because their personalities are different. So we're going to look at the ancient Greek system for defining personalities. It defines 4 different groupings of personality. And you'll be able to perhaps put yourself mainly in one box, but nobody's exclusively in one box. We tend to have one area where we're strong and then other areas where we're less strong. Those who have taken the Myers-Briggs personality survey will see that it's a much more sophisticated survey. And there are other surveys that tell us what our basic personality is. But let's look at this one. The parameters are this. First of all, there's a horizontal line that goes from fun-loving to work-loving or goal-setting. And then there's a vertical line that goes from the bottom, which is to retreat in fear. Most people are more fear-dominated, to more likely to confront in anger. So this divides us up into 4 groupings. We're going to look at the first top left square because that's where the sanguine people live. And what are sanguine people? Well, they are pleasure-loving people. By the way, all of those 4 groups, the little word starts with a P so that you can remember them. Sanguines are all about pleasure. That's what they love the most. That is their raison d'etre. Let's have fun, party on. When it comes to life, they like to inebriate themselves. So this is what the sanguine is. His treasure is pleasure. He's one of those guys who would rather have dessert first. How many people would like dessert first? Yeah, well, you're probably a sanguine. Have the good part first. Delayed gratification is not in their vocabulary. He likes to please himself. He enjoys pleasure. And if he's really selfish, the pleasure is all for himself. Or if he's more altruistic, the pleasure can be shared with others. He likes pleasing others. Now this person, because he likes to have fun, doesn't like to disappoint anybody. And so it's very hard for this person to say no. And this is where boundary problems start to come into play. Hard to say no. You don't want to see disappointment on somebody's face, so you're going to say yes just to keep them happy. I see some nodding in the auditorium right at this time. And they are risk takers. They are given to success. When you're happy, you're liable to do anything because there's no such thing as too much pleasure. No such thing as too much happiness. So these people are given to addictions. If you're a sanguine, watch out. You're going to have to govern yourself from being addicted. They're capable of inebriating themselves and others because they want people to party on with them. And so they like to make people happy, and they like to make them so happy that there's no end to the party. By the way, if you meet some of the best salesmen in the world, they are sanguines. The way they sell you stuff is not by actually getting you interested in the product. They get you happy. And when they get you happy, they can sell you the bridge. They can sell you the CN Tower at a discount, right? Because you're all happy. You're a great guy. Just love the guy. I don't care about the product. He sold me. These people, if they're going to learn boundaries, they're going to have to learn respect. Because it's not all about fun. It's about respecting people. And it's not all about pleasure in life. It's about honoring people it's very important for them to learn respect. I can remember a kindergarten teacher, and she had a little boy in her class that was just a very high sanguine, and he loved to make people laugh, and he would do funny things in class just to make people laugh, and she had a real difficult time trying to control him, and she introduced him to the carpet. You sit on the carpet and you don't say a thing. Well, sanguines need to learn carpet time. Be quiet. Don't say a thing. They need self-control. They need to govern their emotions, and especially their happy emotions. They need to say no to their fun, and that's a hard thing to do for many people. You've heard of the sad death of Whitney Houston, and it would seem from her personality that she was a bubbly lady. She was a pleasure lover. And on the night she died, she had a conversation with her mother because she was taking drugs, and she was getting high on various drugs and on alcohol. And this is what she said to her mother. Mother, tomorrow I'll start to change. I want one more night of pleasure. That's what she said on the night she died. I just want one more night, Mom. One more night of pleasure. The choleric is the next square. It's not that we're all square people. We just fit into squares. The choleric person is a power lover. A power lover. Notice that they're on the work side of the ledger, and they're on the anger side of the ledger as well. And so they're strongly, jealously determined to pursue their goals. They are power loving. And their temptation is to intimidate people. They love to lead. And by the way, we need sanguines so that we can enjoy life. We need choleric people to get anything done in life, because without leaders, we're all running around like chickens with their heads cut off. We need leaders to say, hey, let's go this way. They are strongly task-oriented. They want to get it done. But in their task orientation, they forget about people, and they're capable of running over people to get to their goals. They tend to use intimidation when they're angry, and they say the end justifies the means. And they're the kind of people who would wear that T-shirt that says lead, follow, or get out of the way. They tend to be proud because they do get things done. And they have a lot of strong self-confidence. But pride leads them to folly at times, and they can say yes too often. These people need to learn patience and gentleness and humility if they're going to learn good boundaries. The third group of people are the melancholics. Oh, the melancholics. God love the melancholics. These people are perfection lovers. They're perfection lovers. And if these people tend to get into boundary violations, it's usually by manipulation. They are sensitive and introspective. They are detail-oriented. You want your chartered accountant to be a melancholic. You want your neurosurgeon to have strong melancholic qualities. Don't miss anything, please. Be detail-oriented. These people are more ruled by fear and avoidance of conflict with others than anger. They do get angry, but usually the anger is tempered very much by fear. And when they're hurt, they tend to retreat into themselves, and they feel sorry for themselves for a long time. And when they're in relationship with others, because they are not angry people who strongly assert themselves, they tend to use guilt trips to try to get their way. They tend to use emotional games to get their way. Their faults are usually sins of omission. You don't find them strongly losing their temper and having rages. You find them going into dark despair, and everyone around them becomes sad as well. They're often critical, but when you try to point out a fault in them, they bear that as if they are mortally wounded. These people need faith to come out of themselves because they often retreat into themselves. Their world becomes small, and they don't have the faith to go out and to venture. The Lord needs to give them faith. He needs to give them hope, because these are the people who are most liable to depression. If you're a melancholic, watch out for depression. Watch out for depression. because you need faith and hope to be able to persevere in life and endure the conflicts that come in life. You certainly need to learn faith and hope when it comes to dealing with relationships. The last personality is the phlegmatic personality. And I have to say a lot of good things about the phlegmatic personality because my wife happens to be phlegmatics are the peace-loving people of the world. And as peace lovers, they just love to make peace. They love to placate. They love to be at peace. Their favorite song is "Row, row, row your boat gently down the stream." Let everything just be nice. These are people who enjoy peace. So when faced with a conflict, they seek the quickest path to peace, and that can often be the wrong way to go about it because they placate. They just want to cover it over as quickly as possible and not deal with the truth and with the issues that cause the conflict. Let's just get over it. Just forget about it. And often when I've talked to spouses of people like this, the next day it's as if nothing happened. They've just put that veil of peace over their lives, and let's not talk about yesterday. Don't bring that up again. It's going to cause more conflict. And these people are tempted to half-heartedness as a means of self-protection. Don't put your whole heart into anything, because if you put your whole heart into anything, you're going to be hurt. So you just go half-heartedly through life. These people find it difficult to make a decision, and they're reluctant to say yes because they're looking at the possibilities for being hurt more than the possibilities for advancement and for what can be accomplished. I have a friend of mine who's a true blue phlegmatic, and he regularly takes the blame when there's a conflict, and he apologizes when it's really the other person at fault. And I said, "Why do you apologize?" He says, "Then there can be peace." That's what they want to hear. But the problem is, you see, is that they've completely forsaken the truth. The truth is not the main issue. Peace is the main issue. And so often they lose their way in relationships because they lose truth. So those are the four personalities. We can see how boundary violations can come up because the sanguine has pleasure as his goal, and the melancholic, she has perfection as her goal, and the choleric, she has power as her goal, and the phlegmatic, he has peace as his goal. So everybody's got their goals in relationships. What we're going to see is that none of those are God's primary goals for relationship, not even peace. That's not God's primary goal. Jesus one day said, "I didn't come to bring peace. I came to bring a sword." Wow. Peace is not the primary goal in relationships. More on that later. Third influence, the influence of parenting. Train up a child in the way he should go. That's what the Bible says. And parenting is a very powerful influencer of our boundaries and how we shape our world, how we shape our lives, and how we act and react in relationship to one another. Because our mom and dad are teaching us boundaries by the way they relate to us when we're small. And the only teachers we have are mom and dad, and they're teaching us how to live life, what to think about life. They're teaching us morals. They're teaching us values, what value they place upon different aspects of life. Sometimes those values can be way out of balance because if somebody has a mother who is obsessive-compulsive about cleanliness in the home, for instance, then the child grows up and the child believes the most important thing in life is to be clean because that's my mom's religion. And by the way, it is a religion. It's a religion. When we have some value that's taken out of the pool of regular values of life and exalted to the highest value, that is your religion. It's what you put first, the most important thing in your life. So be careful, you see, what you value the most, and what you're teaching your children to value the most is so important. There's a seminar on powerful parenting. If you want to hear more about that, we could go a long time this morning, talk about parenting and then the influence of parenting. So suffice to say, parents need to teach their children good morals and good boundaries. They need to enforce those boundaries. They need to make sure that the children learn those boundaries by enforcing them and being consistent in the way they enforce good boundaries. We have our grandchildren with us. As grandparents, our job is just to help enforce those boundaries. But we have this little game that we play at the table, and this is a please and thank you restaurant. That's what we use as our game. It's a please and thank you restaurant at Grandma and Grandpa's table. If you want something, you say please, and if you receive something, you say thank you. So that's just our little way of helping, teaching our kids good boundaries. We need to model boundaries. Model boundaries. Boy, if we only understood that 10% of the effect we have on our children is what we teach them, and 90% is what we demonstrate in action. If you regularly lose your temper with your children because they frustrate you, you're not teaching your children anything by an angry tirade against them, except that when you get angry, you can do anything you want and say anything you want, and it's okay. That's what you're teaching them. I'm not a phlegmatic. I'm much more up there in the sanguine, choleric kind of way of life, and I can get angry and lose my temper. And I can remember once when I was out on the Zambezi River with my children. I don't know how many of you have been on the Zambezi River, but I was a missionary there with my wife and my children for some years, and we went fishing one day on the Zambezi River. I know, you said, Jim, you should have been fishing for souls. Why did you go fishing? Well, we had some pleasure. There were 2 lines out the back of the boat, and my son had one line, and my daughter had the other line. They said, now keep the lines wide so that they don't tangle when we go around the corners. But they didn't keep their lines wide, and the lines got tangled. And I knew that it was going to take about an hour for me to untangle those lines. I got so angry. If you don't want to hear anything bad, just close your ears. I said, damn. For the next 3 weeks at home, my children said that word over and over again. I teach them please and thank you all the time. They hardly ever say it. One word, a mess, you see, and they catch on like a bee to honey. And they say, that sounds like a powerful word. Let's use it. Enforcing and modeling boundaries is so important. So I had to say, Daddy did wrong. That was the wrong word. Would you forgive me? See, I had to repent to my kids. One of our grandchildren had 2.5, had this penchant for getting into the candies up in a cupboard that was way over our head. The candies were off limits, and her parents thought that there was no way. But if you look closely, you'll see that she put a few of the cereal boxes and tins on the floor, and she built up a little stepladder there. And she finally got up onto the cupboard, and she opened the cupboard, and our son caught her with the camera, and she turned around, and she said, is there some problem here? Now, that little girl's growing up to be a beautiful lady. So parental boundaries can be likened to fences. We're putting up fences. We're giving them boundaries in life. We're teaching them morals. We're teaching them values. And there's a lesson to be learned from sheep herding, because when sheep do not have a fence around them in the pasture, they tend to huddle together in fear. But when a fence is put around them and a boundary is given to them, then they joyfully and freely spread out around the pasture to the edges of the fence line, and they feel liberty. Good fences produce liberty. They don't produce bondage. They produce liberty. And it says in Psalm 119, verse 45, Psalm 119, verse 45, it's a beautiful verse. It says this, I will walk about in liberty, for I observe your laws. Great verse. Laws bring liberty. Laws bring liberty. When my daughter was 13 years old, the boy started to come knocking. And so I knew I had to lay down a boundary line, a law, in regard to my daughter regarding dating. And I said to her, this is my law. No one-on-one dating until you're 18. She got a little angry at that, a little upset, but she came to accept it. A few years later, she came back to me and she said, Dad, I want to thank you for your law. I said, why do you thank me for my law? Well, when the guys come, she said, I can brush them off real quick. My dad is really, really strong, and he says there's a law I can't date till I'm 18, so get lost. And that's what she did. And she says, thank you. It made it easier for me to deal with boys. Now she's happily married, and she thanked me about that law. There are 3 stages of personal development. When parents are raising their children, they need to know these 3 stages. And it's so important because this is where boundary formation is really happening. First of all, there's a stage called bonding. When the baby is on mother's breast and absolutely no distance between mother and child, the baby is there at the breast, and there's the experience of being one with another person, especially with mother. This is boundaryless, and the baby feels absolutely attached to parents. There is no sense of personhood. It is all boundaryless. It is all lost in relationship. It's funny how when people fall in love, they go back to that sense of boundarylessness. You got to be really careful when you fall in love because it's a very vulnerable time. And when you feel boundarylessness, you can get into great trouble. But in a bonding experience, there's this boundaryless feeling. That feeling is necessary for experiencing true love and acceptance. That is a very, very powerful. That bonding feeling is very, very powerful. And by the way, God wants to give us to that spiritually. Every single child of His, He wants to have that sense of total union with Him. We are one spirit with God. And He wants us to be united so closely to Him that I am His and He is mine, and there's no boundary. That's a wonderful, wonderful sense of love and acceptance. Without that bonding experience, one develops walls, not boundaries, and the child says, I am alone. I am alone. And when the child comes to accept that, they mistrust love. They crave love, but they don't trust it. They often have great walls between them and the other person. It's wonderful to have a mommy and a daddy who love you and are for you. One of my earliest memories is when I was about 2 years of age, 2.5. I remember Mother on the front porch, and she was arguing with the neighbor next door. The neighbor lady next door had a pet dog. It was a cross between a Chihuahua and a pit bull. A very small dog, but bitey. This dog used to come and nip at me all the time. So what did I do? Well, I took my revenge. I bit the dog. I can still remember hiding behind my mother's skirts and listening to her as she defended my actions to the next door neighbor. The next door neighbor said, you don't bite dogs. Dogs don't bite my son. And it went back and forth. What a wonderful thing to have that sense of total security behind mother's skirts. Separateness is the sense that I am not just boundaryless with one person, but I am me. I'm starting to get a sense of personhood. And that often begins as we get into the terrible twos. And they call it the terrible twos because the children are testing the limits of their personhood. They're starting to say, well, I'm me. I have a different life than my mom and dad have. And they learn to think and to feel and to make decisions for themselves. And their wise parents start to give their children little senses of their own decisions. Honey, do you want to wear a red dress today, or do you want to wear a pink dress today, or do you want to go with your jeans? Whichever one you want. Do you want to have these vegetables or these vegetables? No, you can't have no vegetables. You have this vegetable or this vegetable. And you give them choices as they go. And then they learn that they have this ability to make some choices in life. And they learn to accept personal responsibility. They learn to govern their own body. They learn as they grow up to govern their own mind and their own emotions. And that is separateness. My grandchildren are just 3, and when the granddaughter was about 2.5, she was getting this sense of personhood and responsibility. And her 5-year-old sister was in the next room and refused to obey Mother's command. Mother was busy in the kitchen, so Elise took it upon herself to go into Anaya and say to Anaya, Anaya, do you see this finger? This finger says no, no, no. 2.5. Strong sense of personhood. We learn to then integrate. The third section of our development and the formation of boundaries is called integration. And this is where we not only say, I'm me, but we say, you are you. And we need to work together. It's the recognition of others. It's the recognition and the practice of respect of others. So along with teaching Elise and Anaya and Josiah, you see that they have their own personhood and they can make their own choices. They've got to be careful of others. And that's integration. I learned to respect and to love others. I learned to share and to care. And at Christmas time, and I love to talk about my grandkids. I could spend the whole morning. At Christmas time, Josiah was at a function where they were handing out gifts to the children. And the boys all got a little truck. Some of the gifts were left near the door of the place where they were having this Christmas party, and some gifts were stolen. And this little boy was crying his heart out because his gift had been taken and stolen. And Josiah, who loves trucks, went over and he gave this little boy his truck. And I thought, yep, okay, there's integration. There's integration. Josiah is saying, this is mine, but you can have it. This is mine, but you can have it. See, you've got to have a sense that something is yours before you can properly give it away. You've got to own something before you really know that you can share it with others. So having learned that separateness, now you start practicing integration. We learn that not everything is ours. We learn that other people have their stuff too, and we learn not to covet, and we learn to give, and all of those good things in life. By the way, if we get stuck with separateness and we don't learn how to integrate, we become very selfish, self-absorbed people. And these are people who've been spoiled. They've been given everything, and they've not been taught to integrate. They've not been taught that there's other people in life. They just think that the world is their oyster and the world owes them everything. They don't have any integrative qualities. Those people are very difficult people. And when they get into relationships, their boundaries are bad because they just assume that everything's theirs. Here's an important point. Integration is best demonstrated not through the way parents treat their children, important though that is. And that's where a lot of psychologists concentrate on. How are you treating your children? Integration is best demonstrated not through how parents treat their children, but rather how parents treat one another. They are looking at you, and they're looking how you treat your peers. They're looking how a father treats the mother, and how a mother treats the father, and how they talk to one another, and how they interact with one another. They know that you treat them differently because they're small, but they're looking at how you treat peers. And they're looking at mother, and they're looking at father. Now, I'm going to confess to you that many, many times I've heard this statement by people. Well, my husband was bad to me and he left me, but he's a great father to the kids. And I say, you've missed it. Because if a man is not a great husband to his wife, he certainly is not a great father to the kids because he's not teaching them how to love peers. And the essence of friendship and the essence of relationship is, how do you love your peers? How do you love your peers? How much regard do you have for the other adult in the relationship? There's a great failure in parenting if I do not love my spouse. Dr. Dobson has well said, the greatest gift that you can give to your children is to love their mother well. Fourthly, there's the influence of abuse. And I know that in such a group as Celebrate Recovery, this is a common theme because a lot of us have gone through very bad boundary violations as we've grown up. And that's what abuse is. I'm going to call it a severe boundary violation, both moral and personal. Interestingly, when it comes to recovery, the severity of the abuse is not the key factor in recovery. Children can go through some terribly difficult times and have terrible things happen to them. And that does not determine the extent of their recovery. What usually determines a better recovery is that they get comforted and cared for afterwards. Within the environment of comfort and care and trust, blessing, children can go through great trials. And although they're hurt, they can recover because there's the comfort. It's just like a child who's fallen down on the pavement and she skinned her knees, and it's a bad injury. The skin's been broken, and she's crying, but she gets into Mommy and Daddy's arms, and there's a kiss, and there's a hug, and there's comfort. And guess what? The injury's still there. The tears are gone. Why? Because she's enjoying the comfort. And this is a problem when the parents are the ones who provide the abuse, because the people who are supposed to be the comforters don't give them the comfort afterwards because they're the abusers. So the worst kind of abuse is parental abuse, because people are supposed to be the caregivers, and the comforters in sorrow are really the ones who are causing the damage. So these children are doubly abused. They're not only abused by the original offense, but they're abused by the abandonment and the lack of comfort afterwards. That's a real bad sense of abuse. If you've experienced that, my heart goes out to you. I have some patients like that who've experienced that, and they're struggling because there's that not only sense of being hurt, that it's a sense of being abandoned. There was no comfort for my sorrow. And what does abuse look like in relationship? Well, this is a kind of a normal kind of relationship. And when we're with people, we're like that little hexagon up there that is able to touch base with others in relationship, and we can have close relationship and maintain good boundaries. What happens with abused children is that they look like children who have never, ever bonded. And so they're all alone. The aloneness is created by the walls that they have in their heart. They're walls of fear and mistrust of others. There are walls of anger and resentment. There are walls of shame concerning themselves. They feel inside themselves, they feel really small. Why did this happen to me? It's because I'm a bad person. And they retreat into walls of shame. Now, God is able to break down those walls and bring healing. He's able to bring reconnection with good boundaries. It says in Ephesians 2 that the Lord makes peace and he breaks down the barrier of the dividing wall. It says in Psalm 18, verse 29, by my God I can leap over a wall. A wall doesn't have to stop me anymore. Psalm chapter 18, verse 29. God calls these people first to himself, and then he calls them to engage in loving community. I'm thankful for Celebrate Recovery because it represents to me a loving community, and I refer people to this community and to others like it, because I know that counseling alone does not heal people when they've had severe abuse. It does not heal unless you get into a relationship with others where there's loving community. And that loving community, like the church, that's what the church is meant to be, a loving community where people actively engage in loving one another for the purposes of spiritual and social restoration. Last influence, the influence of society. By the time of puberty, peer pressure is usually a greater factor than parental influence. If you haven't gotten your kids' hearts by the time they're teenagers, you are really behind the game. It's possible, but it's very difficult because peer pressure and the pressure of the world around them, the pressure of the popular media, especially now that we have iPhones and you could connect to the world in your hand, and you can see everything that's going on in the world in your hand. That's huge. That's a huge influence. If a child has not internalized a strong sense of moral boundaries and good personal boundaries, she may fall prey to the moral relativism of the majority and the poverty-stricken and perverted values of this world they will adopt. Now, is there hope? Yes, there's hope, because we're going to talk in the next section about boundary reformation. Before we start the second section, let's just pray and commit ourselves again to the Lord. Father in heaven, thank you that on this Saturday morning we can come together and learn of you. And it's not so much about learning just about ourselves, it's learning of you first, and then as we fit into your plan and your will for our lives, and learning the wisdom and the grace and the kindness that comes from you. So open our eyes, open our hearts, open our wills to not only receive the truth but to obey. We give you the praise and thanks in Christ's name. Amen.